brought before maintenance enforcement through an arrangement, Mr. Speaker. If they're not willing to pay, then, Mr. Speaker, we need to have stringent and strong rules in order to enforce it. Mr. Speaker, we also talk about corporate responsibility in this legislation. I think that is very important as well. It's important that when a company refuses to assist in the garnishing of wages, that they be held responsible for that. That is a vital piece of new legislation, Mr. Speaker, one that will ensure that women, and through them the Maintenance Enforcement Division, will be able to actually go out and ensure that a company can't ignore a garnish order, can't sign it, and then decide not to collect the money. In some cases, it's not really arm's length. Some of these companies are probably companies operated by the father. Again, I use that because 99% of the cases are probably men, Mr. Speaker, that the father or the husband is unwilling to pay. And he may set up a corporation as a shell company. The minister suggested that yesterday and again today. There might be a shell company created in order to try and avoid payment. You go through garnishing, the company tries to deny it, the directors can be held responsible. That's the kind of hammer that is needed, but only if the staff is able to actually get around to opening the file and getting around to actually trying to enforce it. And that's a crucial step that this minister has ignored in introducing this legislation. Great on paper, need more staff in order to make it work, Mr. Speaker. There are many other provisions, Mr. Speaker, that need to be talked about. Overall, this legislation will increase the ability of staff when they can get to a file, when they can address a woman's concerns, Mr. Speaker, to actually have the power to fix the things they haven't been able to fix in the past. They will have more power to go in and access certain assets that may be broader definitions than they were before. They will, as I said, have the power to revoke driver's license in greater circumstances. They will have the power to deal with people under corporate shells or corporate responsibility who refuse to deal with garnishing, Mr. Speaker. All these are good. They'll now have the ability to go in and deal with, I guess, lack of a better term, personal property or chattel, because we now can put liens on those, Mr. Speaker, but there's no ability for them right now under the legislation, before this is passed, to allow for maintenance enforcement to go in and put a lien on that. Again, good legislation. But when does staff with 700 cases have the opportunity to go in and impose liens? I don't know. I suggest not very often, because the amount of time it takes, and I speak from a little bit of experience, because at times when I was a workers' advisor, Mr. Speaker, I had 300 or 400 cases, and I know some of them are dormant, not all of them are active, but when you have 700, you're going to have a heck of a lot of active ones. And unlike, for example, in the case of just my own personal experience as a workers' advisor, you would have maybe 300 or 400 cases, Mr. Speaker, but you could sort of know with some certainty when they were going to be coming up. Maybe it's going to take 6 months for a decision to be heard. You deal with it, you put it away, you know in 6 months the appeal is going to come up, or you're going to have to deal with it. There's a little bit of timing that you can coordinate. The problem is with 700 cases is, in theory, tomorrow, 700 men could decide they're not going to want to pay anymore, and you've got 700 cases on your desk having to be dealt with. Now, maybe I assume that's an extreme example, Mr. Speaker, but the fact is that as long as you have 700 cases in which you have no control over, it's in the hands of in most cases, a father or a husband, ex-husband, who does not want to pay. And let's face it, if there's a maintenance enforcement order, in many cases it's because they've already been in a situation where they weren't interested in paying. You're putting yourselves in a situation with that kind of caseload that at any moment you can be overwhelmed. And I suggest to you that is what's been happening, at least in the last 5.5 years, if not since this legislation was implemented. And that goes back to a point that I think I would like to put on the record, Mr. Speaker, which is, it's easy in government to say we're doing something by passing legislation. When the original Maintenance Enforcement Act was passed, I'm sure many governments, I'm not sure which one was in power at the time, would have said, look what we're doing. But it becomes a bit of a mug's game, Mr. Speaker, because what you end up doing is giving false hope to women in this province that this is actually going to help them. And I wonder, I'm sure there are great stories, anecdotal stories of women who've actually been helped by maintenance enforcement. I know of them as well. But overall, if the government isn't willing to put the proper funding in place, there's a lot of women who become very disappointed very quickly with the system. They get trampled by the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy doesn't have the staff to be able to do their job. Again, staff of that division I have a lot of respect for. I know they're doing the best they can. For the job they have, they're doing a heck of a job. But the fact is that the government isn't committed. And really, frankly, Mr. Speaker, In the terms of government funding, it all comes down to putting your money where your mouth is. And if this government isn't willing to put their money where their mouth is with regard to maintenance enforcement, providing the staffing, providing the funding necessary to make sure that we have a legitimate and appropriate and strong legislation that is appropriately enforced to ensure that women in this province get their funding, Mr. Speaker, then the women of this province are being done a disservice. And let's be clear, it's not only the women of this province. Women who don't get regular support, whether it be alimony or child support, Mr. Speaker, have to rely on other forms of government support, Mr. Speaker, whether it be through social assistance, whether it be through unemployment potentially, depending on what type of situation there is. The rest of the safety net has to pick up when the father is not, or the husband, ex-husband is not willing to pay their part. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, part of this legislation, one of the key goals of this legislation, I would suggest as part of public policy, is to ensure that we have legislation that ensures that the person who's supposed to pay pays, so the rest of us don't have to carry the burden. It actually saves the government money in the end, probably. If they actually did a cost-benefit analysis, they may find that by investing in maintenance enforcement, by putting these rules in place and ensuring they're going to be enforced, it could actually save the government money in the Department of Community Services. It could actually do that, but we don't see that. We don't see that commitment. And it would have been nice if the minister yesterday could, and I would have been the first one to shake his hand, if he would have been able to say, we're not only introducing the legislation, we're putting the funding in place to make sure the commitment is there, to make sure this is properly enforced, because we all win when women, mothers, children have the funding they get from their ex-husbands and fathers to ensure that they can actually live the life that they understood they were living when they the relationship ended up ending. Mr. Speaker, those are the things that are important, not only to the women of this province, but to all Nova Scotians. Because if this is the type of province I want to live in, if this is the type of province women feel that they want to live in, they have to know that this is a province that protects their right to the order that they've gotten from a court saying that they get the support and the funding they deserve from their ex-husbands and the father of their children, Mr. Speaker. That's what we need. I haven't seen this government come that far with it. I'm still waiting for that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Justice Critic for our caucus, I'm certainly pleased to rise and make a few remarks on Bill 102, and certainly would echo the comments from the Minister of Justice and the Justice Critic and House Leader for the NDP caucus. I was reminded that, in fact, the Maintenance Enforcement Act was first brought into legislation in this province back in 1995-96 under the Savage administration. That's when the Act was first brought in, and it's good to see that we are now having some much needed amendments being made to the Act. It's now approximately going on 10 years that we've had this legislation, and certainly over the years, with any piece of legislation brought in this House, we find some loopholes, we find some needs to make amendments. One of the most surprising aspects of this session for me as Justice Critic for the Liberal Caucus, Mr. Speaker, is that we haven't heard or seen any mention of a Justice Administration Act for this session, which I think would be the first session in quite some time, where the government on a regular basis introduces legislation in the spring, and by fall, upon reflection, they note some points in the legislation which need tweaking and which need some changing, and so certainly the time had come to make these important changes to the Maintenance Enforcement Act to address some of the long-standing concerns that have been identified by not only the maintenance enforcement staff, but those who depend, the families who depend on it for their income and for part of their livelihood and the maintenance of their children, the maintenance of their homes every year. So we're certainly pleased to see these changes are taking place. So, Speaker, clearly in our society, people are becoming more and more sophisticated as to how to, I don't know if I'd use the term hide, but to be able to put away assets that aren't so easily or readily accessible to the average person or even to government bodies that are trying to fully assess what a person's net worth is or what a person's full assets are. Clearly, these changes are meant to make it easier for the maintenance enforcement staff and for the director to enforce orders by being able to lift the corporate veil in certain circumstances in order to be able to see exactly what a person's true assets are and whether someone is actually trying to hide behind the corporate veil and to keep assets hidden so as to not be required to pay their court-ordered payments. Speaker, has been said by my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage. I think he's correct in saying that every MLA has had phone calls from individuals who rely upon support payments that have told us stories of late payments, missed payments, no payments. And in many cases, I can tell you from my own personal experience, Speaker, that the individuals who are calling are on a very limited income to start off with. A missed payment has a significant impact not only on them, even more importantly, I would say, for us as legislators, it's the impact that it has when children are involved. $50 a month that doesn't show up, $100, $200 or more that doesn't show up, or is a week late, or is a month late, can have a significant impact on people that are on fixed incomes or on low incomes. Because unfortunately, when you owe money, your regular debts, for whether it be for your electricity, for your phone, your cable, your taxes, they don't like it when you miss 1 month. So nor should we allow payers who are under a court-obligated order to pay to miss a month or to be late in their payments. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that you've heard in the media and that both myself and the Justice Critic for the NDP have indicated is our concern over the staff levels at maintenance enforcement. I think the Minister has alluded that he is aware that there are concerns over that. So, in the spirit, I know my colleague went on to indicate why he felt this legislation was coming forward, and I know that he drew some conclusions that he felt that unless it was a minority situation, that this government would not have brought forward these changes, and that may be the case. I'll leave it to him to draw those conclusions. But the fact that it has brought forward, and the fact that it is a minority situation, the fact that I would say all three caucuses have indicated concern over staffing levels, allow me, Mr. Speaker, in the spirit of cooperation, to suggest to the Minister that it would be very timely right now for the Minister to ask an independent person who clearly has a human resources, labor-type background to come in and to review the current staff levels at the maintenance enforcement program, to review the current caseload, and to be able to provide some sort of a report to the Minister, even better to this House, as to what recommendations should be brought forward as to the staffing levels at maintenance enforcement. Is it one more employee? Is it 2? Is it 20? I don't know. And we can sit here and we can guess. And I'm not asking the Minister to have an inquiry or a public commission or anything. Go out, find the appropriate individual at an appropriate cost, and do a review of that department. I think it's clearly something that the NDP caucus is asking for. It's clearly something that we're asking for. And I believe even the government itself has indicated that they're aware that there may be a shortage of staff in that department. So rather than us sit here and point our fingers and try to guess at what the solution is, why don't we do the responsible thing, bring someone in, undertake a review of that department, and have someone provide us with a professional opinion as to what should be done, and then allow the government to react accordingly with that. So I believe that is a reasonable suggestion to make, Mr. Speaker. We're not asking the government to expend tremendous amounts of money in doing this, but I think this would be a responsible way if the government is truly serious about the changes to the Act, about making the Act more enforceable, about protecting the interests of those who rely and the families who rely so heavily on these payments. Then the least the government could do in the spirit of cooperation is to undertake such a review and to report back to the House on its findings. So I do hope that the Minister of Justice will take me up on that offer. I think it certainly would send a signal to our caucus and to the official opposition that the government does take this issue seriously and is prepared to act accordingly. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to take the time in the House to go through all of the changes that are listed here. There has been discussion on that. But clearly, this does close significant loopholes. I think it brings the Act more in line with what our modern technical society is now, the fact that we now use the Personal Property Securities Act, the issue of being able to place liens against personal property where someone is not paid. It is a means of modernizing the Act and bringing it into the year 2004. Now, are there other changes that maybe should have been made? More than likely, there probably is still some changes that are out there that are not contained in this bill. One can only hope that the government will be willing, as we go forward, to be able to bring further legislation in here to amend the Act, to make it stronger. I think certainly everyone in this legislature, regardless of political stripes, accepts that if you owe money for the maintenance of a former spouse, for the maintenance of your children, you have a legal and, more importantly, a moral duty to uphold those payments, to make them on time, to make sure they are not missed, and that I believe as legislators we all want to do our part to make sure that this is enforced and that the court orders and then the families who rely on this so heavily are protected, and that they can be given assurances that we as legislators are prepared to do as much as we possibly can to make sure that those orders are enforced and that they're done so in a timely fashion. Speaker, I know one of my colleagues suggested to me, and he wanted to raise the concern again about the issue of forcing someone to pay when the payer is outside of our jurisdiction. That, I realize, is always going to be a difficult issue. It's always difficult for our province to reach its arm out and go grab payers who are no longer in this province. There is a system in place. I believe the minister himself would recognize it is essential that we continue to work with all other provinces to try to make it sure that it cannot be possible that a payer says, being I have a court order in Nova Scotia, I'm moving up to Toronto or I'm moving to Alberta, and I'm going to do my best to avoid them finding me or to avoid them forcing me to pay. So, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that the minister certainly may wish to address that in his own comments, but that we continue as a province to make sure that if you have a responsibility here in Nova Scotia, regardless of where you live in this country, that you will be expected to uphold that responsibility to those staying here in the province, and that we will work with our colleagues in other jurisdictions not only to help them when they have payers that have located to our province, but they be there to assist us when former Nova Scotians move to their provinces and have obligations back here. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I do look forward to the minister's closing comments on this. I do look forward to the law amendments process. I do hope that we'll have the opportunity to hear from individuals either through their own personal experience or from councillors or even some of the women's shelters around this province, which I'm sure have heard many stories that would relate to the issue of maintenance enforcement, and that they can give us an idea exactly of whether these changes do properly address all of the loopholes out there, or if there are either further amendments that should be brought forward to make this act even stronger. And again, I look forward to seeing whether the Minister of Justice would be willing to entertain my suggestion of undertaking an independent review of the current staffing levels at maintenance enforcement. So with that, Mr. Speaker, our caucus will certainly be supporting this bill at second reading and look forward to its arrival at the Law Amendments Committee. Thank you.
I would like to recognize the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to draw the attention of the House to the West Gallery for an introduction. A resident of Clayton Park is with us this afternoon. His name is Peter Whalen. He is not related to me, although our paths have crossed at City Hall. And I wonder if Peter would rise and receive the warm welcome of the House. Thank you very much.
Yes. Also, I would like to recognize the member for Dartmouth North on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member from Halifax Needham for giving me the opportunity to do this introduction. In the West Gallery, Mr. Speaker, there is a resident of the city of Dartmouth, not a resident of the constituency of Dartmouth North, but of the city of Dartmouth. His name is Mr. Dwight Caldwell, and he's here watching the proceedings of the House today, and I would certainly hope that the House will give him a warm welcome.
Yes. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to take a few minutes to speak on Bill 102, the changes in the Maintenance Enforcement Act, Mr. Speaker, because I think this is a really important piece of legislation, and I want to thank the Honourable Minister for bringing this, this bill forward. A bill, as previous speakers have indicated, will close some loopholes so that a person who has a legal obligation to pay maintenance for the support of their children will not be able to transfer assets to a corporate entity in order to avoid that obligation. Or as well, it allows for a penalty for any person who aids a payer in avoiding their responsibility toward their children. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, this is a situation that occurs all too frequently in the province of Nova Scotia, and indeed probably in other jurisdictions as well. Mr. Speaker, I've worked for many years with families and have seen firsthand the results of situations where a court order exists for maintenance to be paid but is unenforceable for a variety of reasons. And I think, Mr. Speaker, the research, and there's been a great deal of research done into this issue over the years, has established that in particular when a marriage ends, the income of women and children drops dramatically in the situation, where the incomes of men in these situations actually tends to go up. And there is a lot of research that indicates that this is the case. So although there are situations where there are men who have the custody and care of the children, it's more likely that it will be mothers and their children that will be negatively impacted. Mr. Speaker, I want to say in particular around the changes that the minister has brought forward, I want to speak to the memory, actually, of a woman who brought her situation to me a number of years ago, a woman who sadly has passed away. And she used to write, she'd written a number of letters in the Chronicle Herald about women who end up living in poverty following the end of their marriage, where there was a maintenance order, but it proved to be unenforceable due to a hiding of assets by the spouse or the payer. This woman whose name is Anne, I won't use her full name even though she has passed away. I don't know whether she would want that to occur. She made the rounds, I think, to the various political parties in this legislature to talk about what occurred in her situation and the absolute importance of amending legislation and finding a way to ensure that other women would not end up in her situation. This is a woman who worked side by side with her husband in their business for many years. She was the bookkeeper, she was the office receptionist, she kept the schedule of appointments and what have you, Mr. Speaker. And this was a relationship where there was actually a lot of physical as well as emotional abuse, and eventually the marriage ended. And she had an order, but her spouse transferred most of the assets into a corporate entity that was owned by another family member. And the result of that was that this woman went from leading, a fairly comfortable life materially, certainly not in terms of the violence and the abuse she was subjected to, but to living a life of absolute poverty, having to rely on food banks, living in a rooming house, and really being at the mercy of her friends and her support network to have any quality of life at all. And if the changes to this legislation will help us in moving toward the kind of province, society, community that will ensure that somebody in Anne's situation will never go through this again. I can only applaud the minister for bringing forward this legislation. At the same time, the mention has been made that, you know, to enforce legislation like this will require a real concerted effort on the part of the maintenance enforcement staff, and perhaps additional resources. And we will be looking, for the accountability from the government in terms of how this will actually be enforced. And the previous speaker spoke to the issue of implementing and enforcing orders outside the jurisdiction of Nova Scotia, which is a real serious problem. I think that probably all MLAs in this legislature on a fairly regular basis encounter families who live in our constituency who are having difficulty financially, where one of the partners lives outside of the province, has a maintenance order, has failed to comply with that order, and is hiding in another jurisdiction. And we know the difficulties of trying to get maintenance enforced across jurisdictions, although it's not impossible, and we do see success in this area if some spouses are so determined and so deviant that they often do hide in other areas. And this is something that I would encourage the government and the minister to look at, how we can improve on the agreements that we have with other provinces with respect to enforcing maintenance orders that are issued in the Nova Scotia court system. Because this seems to be one of the most significant areas of difficulty for maintenance enforcement. And I think the third area is the whole area of the underground economy. And it's an area that requires some study, but in my experience working with families, I know that this is an area where there also is a fair amount of hiding assets and income in a way to get around the maintenance that is ordered through the courts. So I applaud the minister for bringing forward these amendments. I encourage the government to continue to look for ways to improve on maintenance enforcement, and I ask that we find the resources to implement this legislation and to improve on the enforcement of maintenance orders outside our jurisdiction, so that children and parents, quite often women, are not left with situations where they're having a difficult time paying the rent and putting food on the table. And that's the reality still for too many families. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate. Yes, the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you.
Is not on? Well,
No.
Perhaps we'll ask.
It is now.
It is now. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for allowing me to say a few words on this bill. First of all, I do want to commend the government for, improving the bill. This bill, of course, improves the Maintenance Enforcement Act, and I think that that's very important because, as has been said by other members of this House, this is an area that is so important to hundreds of people that who are left often in poverty as a result of one parent's failure to honor their duty and pay maintenance for their children when there's a breakdown in family. And I think that it's so important that we continually monitor and look for for those shortcomings in legislation that we have when it's recognized that the impact on individuals and on families is so great. So it's very important that this has been brought forward, that the deficiencies in the current act were looked at, and that we've been trying to plug away, I guess, and plug up some of the loopholes that exist that allowed people to either be in other jurisdictions and not honor their obligations, or simply to abdicate their responsibilities. So I particularly wanted to commend the government for looking at that. I feel that in the vast majority of cases, of course, it is the fathers that have left their responsibilities and left the mothers and children on their own to suffer often the severest poverty. And again, our system of social services does not rescue those people. And I think that it's important that the parents are called first to stand up and take responsibility for their children and for their maintenance, and that's very important, because as I say, what we see every day in our constituency offices are the people who perhaps have not got that support and have not got the ability to earn a living, and in fact are relying upon our own social service net to save them, and it doesn't. In fact, it does not pay enough money to maintain people in their homes and to keep their children and their families properly fed and clothed and housed. And I see that every day in Clayton Park, and I'm sure it's a story that is repeated across the province. Certainly in the area of Clayton Park, the rents are so high that the amount given to a mother with children, to maintain that family is inadequate. There are no apartments available that come under the housing allowance that's provided by community services. And therefore, what mothers are doing is having to draw upon their food allowance and the other allowances in order to just pay the rent, just to put a roof over their heads. Exactly, and so that the things that are really designed, maybe federal money they receive as child tax credit is also helping to pay the basic bills, the power and the phone bills, and the necessary costs for putting their children in school. And so those things are so pressing in our province, those issues about the inadequacy of social services and community services to help people who have fallen on hard times and who need our help. I think that it is tied into the need as well to have parents, and again I say particularly the fathers, who have the wherewithal and the money to come forward and be forced to pay the amount owed to their families, so that their children do not live in poverty, or at least are able to be fed and housed appropriately. So I think that the two issues are related. It's wonderful for us to be looking at supporting single mothers who need that maintenance for their children. And it's also important to realize that the other systems in place in our province are inadequate. And that means that when these measures fall through and the mother is forced to turn to community services, that we had better re-examine that as well and look more deeply to see how we can help people maintain their dignity, maintain enough money to at least provide for their children in a basic way, and help them to rebuild their lives, because that's what we're not doing. We give them so little that you never get out from underneath the pressure of having not enough money, of juggling your bills, and you're never able to rebuild your life because of the pressure you're living under every day, Mr. Speaker. So for many of us here in this House, I think it's a reality. We've spoken to people and we know the kind of stresses they're under. And when you're under threat of eviction, or you're having the creditors calling every minute for very basic costs that you've incurred, it's really important that you realize those people cannot go out and find a job and rebuild their lives. They can't take extra training or anything else when they're under threat of eviction and they don't know where their children will sleep tomorrow. So I think it's really important that we look at all avenues to improve the lives of Nova Scotians that need our help. And certainly the improvements here to this Maintenance Enforcement Act will certainly help some women and their children in this province, and I applaud that effort. And I hope that we'll continue to look for ways to strengthen that and any other means we have to improve the lives of women and children in Nova Scotia. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
You should know that quite well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to applaud the Minister today on his amendments to the Maintenance Enforcement Act. This act has been around for almost a little over 9 years now, and in my former job as Executive Director of the Whitney Pier Youth Club, I've heard many stories of maintenance enforcement, horror stories, I guess, that I'm hoping that this will put more teeth into the act, that we'll be able to garnish wages. Mr. Speaker, a missed payment to a single mother with a family we all have to realize that this affects the most vulnerable citizens, our children, our youth in our communities. And what they don't have, it's just later on in life, it's terrible to see, you know, not been able to garnish somebody's wages. I hope now that when the maintenance enforcement program comes, they'll be able to garnish somebody's wages, whether he's in the province of Nova Scotia or in the Yukon. It doesn't matter where that person is located at. He's still responsible as a parent for his children. Today in society, there's so many single parents that are out there struggling. When their maintenance enforcement check doesn't come in, and they're looking to do something with their children, they can't. So naturally they fall back to community services to see an intake worker to replace the money that they were supposed to be given on a monthly basis. Mr. Speaker, I know from firsthand experience that these people see an intake worker again and say, I need a check, an emergency check right away to cover the child maintenance that I did not receive for this month, which another overburdens our community services departments because they're constantly going in. So hopefully with this new amendments that these people will not be able to hide their assets from the government and from the people. And the only thing that I see is that staffing issues and caseloads will probably double. We'll need additional resources to enforce this act. I think that that's going to be important. But also remember that hopefully that this will be better for the most vulnerable citizens, our children. And I commend the minister, and I look forward to it going to law amendments so everybody will be able to have a say on it. And I again thank the minister. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to take an opportunity to speak just briefly on this bill. First of all, I want to let the minister know and to let the minister be aware that I don't have the concerns that some of the other members of this legislative assembly might have with respect to the minister not fully understanding that along with the additional responsibilities that are afforded through this piece of legislation, that there won't be additional staff. Because it's my opinion, Mr. Speaker, that the minister is very much aware of the overburdened responsibility of the staff members and the number of case files that they have, and that in fact this will only add to those case files of the staff within maintenance enforcement, and that the minister himself will know that in fact these added responsibilities will require additional staff. And for that, I don't have the concern, Mr. Speaker, of some of the members of this legislative assembly. I think the minister is quite prepared to put money into this maintenance enforcement department. Also, Mr. Speaker, I want you to know as well is that we all 52 constituencies across this province has at least one time or another dealt with a maintenance enforcement issue. And some of us in constituencies have dealt with more than our fair share of maintenance enforcement issues. And we've heard individuals come into our offices and tell us that they know that their ex-husbands have X number of dollars and that they've got these accumulated assets and that they own property, that they own motorboats, they own skidoos, and they own cars and Ferrari. Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say Ferraris, but they do own automobiles as well, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I would say that they come into the office with total frustration on the issue of why their ex-partner, in fact, are much better off or deemed or seem to be much better off than they. And I would tell you that this piece of legislation at least allows the government the opportunity to tap in and put a lien on those personal properties that in fact these individuals who normally are called deadbeat dads, but individuals who choose not to pay their maintenance enforcement payments. It's very important to recognize that every time a maintenance enforcement payment is not paid, it has absolutely no effect on the former spouse or partner, but it has a tremendous effect on the individual who is waiting for that check. Often the dollars are then have to be supplemented by the Department of Community Services, and I'm very pleased to see that the minister has identified the Department of Community Services as one of those agents of government whereby it will be able to put in the message in through the channel of ME in order to address this very important issue of making sure that it's possible. The problem that I have with people who come to my office and who have come to my office over time with respect to maintenance enforcement is the long duration of time it takes sometimes to get those monies. The other problem that I have is that they know that their ex-partner is working, maybe under the table, has accumulated tremendous dollars, has accumulated these personal assets and so on, and there's no way that maintenance enforcement could touch it, nor could they get their hands on it. Hopefully through this piece of legislation, that will happen. I'm still at a loss, Madam Speaker, to understand how maintenance enforcement will be able to extract monies from individuals who work under the table, whose corporations won't identify them as being employed and working there, and yet we know, and yet the Department of Community Service may very much be aware, and as well as maintenance enforcement might very much be aware that that is there, but technically there's no mechanism to grab onto it and pull it together so that we know that in fact we're able to extract those dollars. Maybe this comes under the corporate responsibility that the minister is talking about, but I don't see the strength in that of those individuals who work under the table. I can see that those individuals who are working for a known corporation and that in fact it's identifiable that there is the opportunity. But I do want to say, Madam Speaker, that the Minister of Justice in his position here has identified crucial components to the maintenance enforcement that in fact have not been touched before, and gives maintenance enforcement an access to those revenues or those dollars that normally should be shared by the spouse and the children. And the reason why I say the spouse, Mr. Chair, Madam Chairman, and I've been avoiding much of that through because I do know a number of people who came up here to speak identified mostly male, because 99% of them are male. I tried to be consistent and say there are in fact women who do as well avoid their role of responsibility because of the dollars that they have had, and we've had those comments come through the constituency office as well, and that there have been maintenance enforcement agreements attached to them. The bottom line is that, Mr. Minister, it is a good piece of legislation. It is a piece of legislation that I know that you and the staff at Maintenance Enforcement have put in a tremendous amount of hours on, and I do know that you've worked very hard to make sure that you will access all those available resources, that someone who has access to them can be shared by someone who doesn't. And also, I do not, once again, have the fear of some of my colleagues in this legislature that you won't put in the proper human resources to help administer the additional responsibilities that go with this. Mr. Minister, I think that you will do that. Also, I don't believe that there will be much representation or many witnesses presented before law amendments on this piece of legislation. And I think that we would be foolhardy to think that there is going to be a lineup in the Red Room to talk about this piece of legislation. My guess is that you have worked with the people of Nova Scotia and many other individuals on this piece of legislation, and in that, in fact, it'll come back to this chamber very quickly, Madam Speaker. And with that, again, I want to thank my colleagues, other members of the legislature who have spoken on this piece of legislation, and thank the minister, the staff of his staff, and the staff of ME for the kind job that they have done on this. Bye. Thank you for that.
The honourable member from Cape Breton West.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I will be quite brief on this particular topic because our critic has pretty well highlighted the issues related to this particular piece of legislation, but there are some issues of a practical nature I thought that I would make reference to in a general fashion that I hope that the minister would take notice to and perhaps act on a future day. Unlike my colleague, the previous speaker, I have a concern about the human resources component in the Cape Breton region, not about the quality, but rather the lack of quantity. There's considerable concern, Madam Speaker, that many of the staff within the maintenance enforcement component of the Department of Justice are being overworked, and they have been overworked for a number of years. And they are receiving not sufficient financial resources and ergo the sufficient staffing to be able to cope with the increased workload. And while it's quite noble for the minister to provide legislation that will ensure corrective measures on certain aspects of maintenance enforcement, all this legislation won't be of much value unless we have the resources to be able to make it a realization. So I want to put that on the public notice issue, Madam Speaker, because I have had occasion over the last 5 years to deal with a number of cases, and it's quite concerning that every time we go back to maintenance enforcement, it all comes down to one issue: a lack of staffing within that department. And I don't think that issue is getting better; it's getting worse. And I would respectfully ask the minister to consider increasing staffing levels in the Cape Breton region. I can't speak for other areas of the province because I haven't researched that aspect of it. Just to signify the impact that has, Madam Speaker, is also in terms of its relationship with its federal partner, particularly those through Revenue Canada and Human Resources Canada, in terms of securing the appropriate information and the timely data that's required to ensure that if a mother of small children that needs the money to buy groceries is forthcoming. And because of that breakdown between the two levels of government, I've had several cases where people have suffered unnecessarily and have been forced to go and submit themselves to the Department of Community Services just to find the basic needs of groceries, bread and milk. I mean, you can't get more basic than that, Madam Speaker, as well as just sufficient money just to keep the lights turned on in their home. So I would ask the minister to perhaps not only take action on that, but to apprise all members of the House as to what success he has had on this particular issue, because it's a major issue. The lack of coordination between the federal agency and the province of Nova Scotia. To give you an example where that type of cooperative effort has been a success is with the Workers' Compensation Board. The collaborative agreement that was signed back in 1999 between the Workers' Compensation Board, the Revenue Canada, and a number of other government departments realized a tremendous benefit for the employers and the employees right across the province of Nova Scotia, and that type of ease was only through that collaborative effort. Somewhat of a different issue, but yet the parallel is quite simple, that when both levels of government cooperate, then the maximum benefit can be realized. And I'm speaking perhaps more so for the children that are adversely affected than the parents and the guardians, who in many cases perhaps have greater ability to fend for themselves. And that brings it to a very basic common denominator, Madam Speaker. But it is an issue. I believe the minister is aware of this. And having this issue, this particular piece of legislation before the House affords all members to be able to flag these issues with the minister. And I feel confident that if the minister is sincere in what he says through this particular piece of legislation, he will act on that. Because it's one thing to deal with the corporate veil, it's another thing to deal with issues where folks, individuals will hide their assets and resources in other jurisdictions beyond the reach of the province of Nova Scotia. But it's quite another to have two major agencies almost side by side, not collaborating. And another issue of concern I have is the fact that sometimes after some movement back and forth on realizing a settlement for maintenance, whether it be through the actions of the Maintenance Enforcement Division of the court or what have you. The fact of the matter is, what I found a little bit unsettling is sometimes the solicitor for representing a client that has children would actually take his or her fees off the top, which effectively those dollars were designed to support the children, feeding those children. And I find that's a very disturbing issue to have brought before my office when you'll see somebody who is in a position of trust, in a position of resources, and lots of opportunity to deal with that. This is a very serious matter, and I would respectfully ask the minister to take that on notice as well, because, for example, if a single mother going through a divorce has 2, maybe perhaps 3 children, and hasn't received any resources for 2, maybe 3 months from her spouse, and then all of a sudden, when the settlement finally comes through, then lo and behold, a good chunk of that money is clawed out for legal fees or for whatever. I don't believe that maintenance enforcement should be cutting checks to a third party to allow them to sever off that money that's designed to help the children and the parent who is in most need. So I would, without getting into specifics, and I think the minister understands the dynamics of what I'm saying, and it's a very serious issue, and it's a disturbing trend, I believe, that may be occurring. Also, another issue, Madam Speaker, is with regards to another case that I've had occasion to deal with, and that is the issue of language barriers for certain individuals in the province of Nova Scotia, those of Acadian or of French origin who are having difficulties in maneuvering through the legal system of Nova Scotia. And perhaps the minister is aware of a case or two, but certainly I'm aware of one very prominent case that has created a considerable consternation, not only in terms of custody, but also in terms of maintenance and maintenance enforcement. So the minister is a very learned individual on the issues of law in Nova Scotia, particularly family law, and I think he'll certainly give some serious consideration to the issues I've raised, and with that I'll certainly be, as my colleague, the critic, has suggested, giving ratification to this, move on to law amendments. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member from Hants East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to make a few comments on this piece of legislation, and I know the minister would like to see things move along. So it's not my intention to punish him any longer than necessary. Madam Speaker, like so many things that we do in this job that are untried or unusual territory, I guess, for some of us, and any issues around maintenance enforcement for me are definitely that area. They are an area that I am so lacking in knowledge that it's perhaps shameful. and I guess the reason I want to speak today is because I've had the occasion, and actually very recently, last week, as a matter of fact, to walk into my office and have a woman sitting there crying around issues of maintenance enforcement, and this is someone that I have known for a number of years. So I know some of the history of her situation, but I've been, I guess, some distance from it, and I guess when it gets relayed to you in a very emotional fashion, it tends to make you ask a lot of questions about what goes on with this system, that someone's life can be held in limbo because of a lack of legislation or a lack of direction on the part of government. So I called maintenance enforcement on her behalf, and I was about to take the system apart brick by brick, from when I got on the phone. And what I guess the thing that became immediately apparent to me, and I was a little surprised, was the inability for me to talk to her caseworker without her consent, without the permission of the individual. But that didn't work. I had the woman sitting in my office, and I handed her the phone, and I said, around privacy issues, you please give them permission to speak to me. All to no avail. In other words, the caseworker still couldn't relay any information to me, and it had to go to another level. So I spoke to somebody else. I forget the name of that person's title, but I was really surprised by this. I mean, I hadn't run into that dealing with the federal government. I hadn't run into it dealing with any other department. And but yet with maintenance enforcement, it seemed to be these privacy issues had to be dealt with somebody else at a completely different level than the caseworker, and I found that to be somewhat cumbersome. But with that said, I did have a good conversation with this person at the next level, and she I think tried to dispel my concerns to a point. But one of the things that became immediately evident to me was that people working in this system have far more of a load than anybody can humanly manage. And I was trying to make the case that no one from maintenance enforcement ever gets back to this woman to tell her anything about where they're at in pursuit of dollars or money from her ex-partner. And I was told it was impossible for them to do that. I said this woman doesn't get any information unless she calls. The maintenance enforcement never knows anything about her former partner unless she gives them the information. So I just wondered what maintenance enforcement did. And then I was told that they have a caseload of 700 cases. So even for me in this job, I'm not burdened to that level, and I think I'm overworked. Trying to get back to people and stay on top of it is a continuous battle, and I can't believe that anybody could maintain a workload of 700 cases. Now, my colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage made the point, or I think he tried to make the point, that not all of those cases would be active at any one time. So, I want to make sure that I'm at least dealing with reality here, but certainly, even if there's a slight bump, I mean, I would say that even if you conceive of how many of those might be, there's only 365 days in a year, and we don't work all of them. So to have 700 cases would seem to me to be a fair burden for anybody to legitimately handle and pursue. And I want to say there are things in this bill that address some of the concerns that were raised to me, and I want to applaud the minister for those, and in particular, the ability for maintenance enforcement to go after a delinquent dad or a partner even after they've made an arrangement and then defaulted on that arrangement. I think that is so important. I want to say to the minister that use every tool in your arsenal to try to help, and I'll say mostly, certainly, I would see mostly women who are neglected in this regard, and women and children. And this has been the burden for this woman. I mean, I don't think that she's overly concerned about herself, but she basically has raised their children herself. And I've dealt with issues around community services for her because she couldn't get enough money to do that. She has gone the extra mile to raise her children in some kind of quality of life, and she deserves to be commended, and she deserves better than she's gotten out of the system. So I want to say that anything that the minister and this government can do to help her and women like her, I am all for it, because it showed me a world that I am totally unaccustomed to, and it's one of those things that when you see it, you want to say something has to be done, and it has to be done now, and what can we do? So I was very glad when I came back to our caucus office to find out that this bill was going to be introduced, and I really hope that it will do. And I want to say to the minister, I want to echo the concerns of my colleague, our House Leader, that don't cut the feet out from underneath this bill right off the start. Put the resources in place to ensure that the people who are going to pursue this actually have the resources to do it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise to close debate. First, I would like to thank all of the members who took the time to speak on the bill. I think the one common denominator of everyone who took the time to speak on the bill is the fact that each and every one of us, in the course of our duties as a member of the legislature, have had occasion to speak with Nova Scotians who have been directly affected by the maintenance enforcement system in our province. And I recognize that every one of us has spoken in a sincere attempt to try to bring those concerns and experiences to the floor of this House and to the debate on the subject. I would also caution, because a suggestion had been made, and I think it's unfair, Madam Speaker, and I think I should speak to it. The suggestion had been made that the only reason this bill was brought in was in a minority government. Well, I think with all due respect that that's unfair, and the reason I believe that our action has demonstrated that that's unfair is because I believe our government has been consistently a supporter of law reform. And we have brought in many, many bills. In fact, one member of the House joked with me about, is this another uniform bill? And the reason, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, that we have supported a lot of uniform legislation, including the Uniform Interjurisdictional Support Orders Act, is because we want to convince other Canadian jurisdictions to do what they should be doing to modernize their laws, as we have been very effective in this House in doing, so that when Nova Scotian recipients have the payor moved to another province, that they have the legislative framework in their province that will protect our recipients in the same way that we would do for their recipients. Madam Speaker, I think that's an important point. About one of the important things about uniform legislation, about keeping our laws modern, is because it does act, I believe, as a legitimate encouragement to some other jurisdictions which have not been as thorough, perhaps, in bringing their laws up to date, in making sure that we do that. Because I know all members have had occasion, and in my course of the practice of law, I had occasion to have clients who had a payor that moved to another province, and one where there are very minimal enforcement systems in place, that recipient, those recipients in Nova Scotia suffered as a result of that lack of a framework in another province. So that our work with uniform law, our work in trying to modernize our legislation, I think, has a beneficial effect in trying to, both by example and by the adoption of uniform law processes, demonstrate to others the value of that. Now, there have been so many points raised in the course of debate here today that I won't attempt to address them all, other than to say that I certainly have made notes about some of the concerns that have been raised with respect to individual kinds of cases today. But the transcendent message is that all members on both sides of the House share a commitment to making sure that those court orders are enforced. And I also can tell the honourable members that the Department of Justice and I share a commitment to legitimately reviewing in a very appropriate way the resource issue to make sure that the legislation we have works. I can also tell you that I know that some of the biggest problem we've had, it's been communication issues, and I think some of these are communication issues, where recipients whose money does not show up on time, where commitments were made by a payor that were defaulted upon, perhaps weren't informed in a timely fashion about that default, and therefore rent checks bounced, other commitments were failed, commitments were made to children about summer camps or other kinds of important family activities didn't carry through. And those people and those recipients are generally distressed by those kinds of things. And one of the things I think we need to improve, as much as we can improve, is the mechanisms for communication with recipients so that the length of time that a call comes in before it's returned is the minimum amount necessary. And so I would thank all members for their comments. I can assure you, honourable members, that I would look forward to further discussion with this bill, and I would ask that the bill receive second reading and be referred to law amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker.
The motion is for second reading of Bill 102. Is the host ready for the question? Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye? Aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The clerk will read the title of the bill.
An act, Bill number 102, an act to amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Maintenance Enforcement Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker. Would you please call Bill 101 the Public Service Act?
Public Service Act. Recognize the Minister of Community Services. Service, Nova Scotia, and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to move second reading of Bill number 101 and would like to provide a few brief remarks. This bill provides straightforward amendments to the Public Service Act to formally establish the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs. The amendments to the Public Service Act enable government to appoint Chief Executive Officer to hire staff for the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs. Currently, the office has 2 staff, both seconded from within government. At this point, I'd like to take a moment to publicly thank the 2 staff people who have worked very hard over the past year to help us bring this office together and to fruition. That would be Wayne Hamilton, who is the interim executive director, and his capable assistant, Vanjie Williams, who have both worked very hard on behalf of the province of Nova Scotia to see this office come to the stage where it is right now. With the appropriate staffing numbers, the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs will be able to move forward with its mandate to assist, support, and enhance the province's delivery of services to African Nova Scotians. The office structure also helps to ensure the needs and issues of African Nova Scotians are represented in the government and are addressed. With the amendments, Nova Scotia will be the only province in Canada with a legislative agency dedicated solely to the interest of African Canadians. And although this act formally authorizes the office, in reality we have been actively working on developing this office over the past year. I want to just bring to the attention of members of the House and to all Nova Scotians some of the efforts that have taken place as a result of this office. Over the past year as minister, I've had the opportunity to meet with countless individuals and organizations and groups to talk about the structure of this office and the work that it's about to do. My work began essentially day one with meetings with individuals and groups and organizations, and carried me across this province in several occasions where we've gone from one end of the province to the other end to ensure that the interests and the concerns and the issues of individuals in this province were addressed and that their concerns would be reflected in the day-to-day operations of this office. I've had the opportunity to speak with groups and individuals involved in the delivery of social services, provision of policing, education, healthcare, nearly every facet of life. And I've had the opportunity as well to meet with individuals and groups from Yarmouth, Weymouth, Digby, Shelburne, Preston, Hammonds Plains, Lucasville, Cherrybrook. We've been to Truro, Amherst, New Glasgow, Antigonish, Guysborough County. We've been to Cape Breton Regional Municipality. We've visited nearly every African Nova Scotian community in the province of Nova Scotia. And as I said earlier, we spoke with and met with individuals and with groups, some as small as 1 and 2 to as large as several hundred. And we've been able to develop this office to the extent that it is. As well, at the same time, our staff embarked on a series of consultation to ensure that we were going down the right path in the right direction. I am relatively confident that the office will not only meet the needs and the expectations of African Nova Scotians, but it will exceed those needs and expectations in many cases. One of the things that I was concerned with at the very beginning was that we would develop an office that was centrist to Halifax, that served our needs and not necessarily the needs of all of Nova Scotia. So that's why we embarked on such an extensive consultation. And the comment and the feedback that I'm getting as minister has been one that's expressed extreme positive remarks back. And I'm pleased to say that the acceptance and the embracement of this office by Nova Scotians has made my job and our job in the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs much easier than some would have anticipated. In closing, I want to say that we are now developing our office structure. It is nearly complete now. We've been in the process through our staff, particularly through the hard work of Wayne Hamilton, of developing an operational plan that we anticipate releasing at some point in time in the very near future. We still have some additional work to do, including hiring of those key important staff people to fill the roles that are necessary for us to do the work we're doing, as well as finding appropriate locations and a service delivery model so that people will understand the work that we do and the way that we do it and the benefits of having this Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs. I want to as well point out to members of the legislature the fact that we are the only province in this country to have an office like this has brought to my attention interest from other jurisdictions, and I've had the opportunity to share our experience and our views with individuals from Ontario, from British Columbia, from Saskatchewan. As well, I had the opportunity to share with officials from the United Nations and other officials, including the federal government, who have expressed interest in what it is we're doing. And having said that, I'm prepared to listen to the remarks of the members opposite on this bill.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise in my place and make a few remarks, Mr. Speaker, about Bill 101, an act that establishes the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs. As the Minister knows, this caucus are very much in support of the establishment of this office, and we and I have said so in the past. And last spring, when the government brought forward its budget, during budget debate, I had an opportunity to ask questions of the minister over in the Red Room, and one of my questions, in fact, was whether or not this House could expect to see legislation brought forward that would, in fact, define and entrench in legislation the office. So I'm very pleased to see legislation come forward in that regard. Mr. Speaker, I saw the bill yesterday for the first time during the bill briefing, and it's not a lengthy bill. I would like to speak to a few aspects of the bill if I can. But first of all, I'd just like to talk a bit in terms of a little background, because I think background is really important for people perhaps outside the African Nova Scotian community who will be watching this development and will have some questions about what it is we're doing here with respect to this legislation. Mr. Speaker, we know that there is a long history of African Nova Scotian involvement in our province. Persons of African descent have played a very important role in the history of the province, starting back when Matthew DaCosta was an interpreter or a translator of record for in the 1600s with the establishment of Port Royal in that area with Samuel de Champlain. There is a very strong and amazing history in this province with respect to the Black Loyalists coming to Nova Scotia after the American Revolution, the Maroons and the building of Halifax Citadel, the Underground Railroad, and persons of African descent coming to this province after the American Civil War, and on it goes. There's quite a substantial and lengthy history that we are still, I think, learning about in a more systematic way in our school system and through Black History Month that is hopefully of great importance that will enrich the lives of all people in this province. And Mr. Speaker, in the province of Nova Scotia, there are slightly under 2% of our population of African Nova Scotian descent. And some people may ask the question, why, with so small a group, is there the establishment of this office? And Mr. Speaker, the answer is apparent that, that's precisely the point, because African Nova Scotians in our province are a small population. It's all too easy for the majority sometimes to trample the rights of people in a small group, and it also is all too easy to overlook the needs of people in such a small group that represent a minority of the population. So this indeed is why it's important to actually take and structurally locate some resources, the resources of government, to provide a place where people have not had a voice to express their experiences, their needs, their aspirations, their ideas, their perspectives that are frequently absent from the political policy arena. And Mr. Speaker, if we look at the history of race relations in Nova Scotia for 250 years, there are many, many different chapters. We've had our own Rosa Parks in this province, Viola Desmond, who had to fight the fight of against segregation.
I wonder if the honourable member would allow for an introduction.
Certainly, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'll recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I could turn to the West Gallery. I'd like to introduce Terry Little, Robert Thibault's assistant in Middleton, and her son Garrett, who are here with us this afternoon.
I think one of them might be a little shy. And indeed, welcome to all the members, visitors in our gallery today. Honourable member from Halifax Needham, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was just remarking on on some of the strife that we've seen in our province in many, many chapters of race relations in Nova Scotia, where members of the Black Nova Scotian community have had to fight for their rights and their rightful place in our province. And I was remarking that we had our own Rosa Parks, Viola Desmond, who had to fight segregation by refusing to take a seat in a segregated area to see a movie in the New Glasgow area. In my constituency in the north end of Halifax, there is an unwritten chapter in race relations around the efforts of Senator Calvin Ruck and Gus Wedderburn, Buddy Day, a former Speaker of this House, and others to get the Metropolitan on Gottingen Street to hire Black sales clerks in a community where there was a substantial Black population, but people were unable to get work in the very shops that they did their business in and that they brought their business to. We have a history of seeing various injustices, some that have not been rectified, Mr. Speaker. We've seen the forced relocation of the settlement of Africville. So there are many, many situations we can point to throughout the history of our province where the African Nova Scotian community have been at the mercy of the racism in our society, really, in terms of their rights to full citizenship in our province. And Mr. Speaker, I think that there have been efforts, many efforts by the Black community to organize and to further their own aspirations. And some of these have resulted in significant gains, and some have, I think, for many African Nova Scotians, been a point of frustration sometimes with the realization that there's still a mighty long way to go, as people will say. In the 60s, we saw the formation of the Black United Front. The Black United Front in Nova Scotia was an organization, an umbrella organization that covered the province of Nova Scotia, that had offices and field workers around the province, providing a variety of services and information, did individual casework and advocacy, community development, community organizing, and operated arm's length from government, although funded by government. And sadly, the Black United Front, for many people, came to an end when a former Liberal government removed funding off this organization and set up a task force on issues in the Black community that came back with a series of recommendations, including, I believe, the idea that perhaps a secretariat be established in the province. And then those recommendations sort of disappeared from the political landscape until the government brought forward the idea that they would establish an Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs. So, Mr. Speaker, that's sort of a very crude and simplistic summary of some of the background to how we have arrived at the place we're at today. Mr. Speaker, the legislation in front of us sets out some objectives and purposes for the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs that really give us a bit of a structure. It talks about the office will do a variety of things. It will have a staff. It will will work within government to try to have a more integrated approach to matters relating to the African Nova Scotian community. Nobody could disagree with those objectives. Also, to represent the interests of the province in intergovernmental initiatives and negotiations. And one of the areas that certainly comes to mind for me is hopefully the negotiations that are going on around reparation for the former residents of Africville. Another objective or purpose of the office is to do research and do some policy analysis and provide advice to government on African Nova Scotian issues, and as well to develop and communicate on cooperation, communication strategies, public education, etc. Now, all of these objects and purposes of the office, I think, are fine objectives and purposes. But I want to say to the minister that I do have a concern, and I'm very interested in hearing from members of the African Nova Scotian community and others as the law amendments process unfolds, in terms of whether the objectives and purposes set out here are strong enough, if they're broad enough in some ways. I think that, I know when the minister made his remarks, he talked about a plan that will be brought forward soon. And what I want to say to the minister, and I'm sure he's heard this in his consultation around the province in the 30-some African Nova Scotian communities, is the fact that there have been so many reports and so many task forces and inquiries over the years, and the absence of any real movement on many of those reports in terms of implementing the reports and action is what I certainly hear all the time from members of the African Nova Scotian community who I have contact with. They talk about the need for a comprehensive action plan that actually starts to implement many of the studies and the recommendations that have been gathering dust for so long. I think, for example, about the importance of full implementation of the Black Learners Advisory Committee report. Education is the great equalizer in our society, and all too often, members of the African Nova Scotian community are still disadvantaged in the education system. And many of the recommendations of the Black Report speak to the concrete activities that need to occur with the support of government in order to address those serious educational barriers for Black Nova Scotians. I look at the research and reports that we have seen on the issue of Black youth and the restorative justice program, and the need to ensure that Black youth are getting the full benefits of restorative justice. I look at the human rights decision for in the case of Kirk Johnson, the boxer, and I challenge this government to do something about the flaw in the Human Rights Act in this province that will see this individual have to pay legal fees against HRM for pursuing his human rights and for having a decision. You know, here's a young man who has a decision in his favor in front of the Human Rights Commission, yet he's going to have to carry a huge financial penalty for having pursued that complaint, all because our Human Rights Act is silent on the question of costs. And, you know, there are some very concrete and tangible things that we could do right now that would send a huge message, I think, to the African Nova Scotian community with respect to our commitment to really changing aspects of our legal structures in the province that could contribute to better well-being for them. And what better place to start than with our Human Rights Act? I look at the statistics that we get from our own civil service in the province of Nova Scotia, and I must say I'm always quite frustrated at seeing the lack of depth of information that we have in terms of paying attention to where in our public service are there members of the African Nova Scotian community in terms of positions of leadership, of influence, of policy development, and what have you. So I would like to hear from members of the community with respect to the objectives and the purposes of the office, whether or not those objectives and purposes really capture their expectations that this is an office of action, this is an office that will actually result in a significant change in what historically has been all too slow a process in terms of realizing the equity that African Nova Scotians seek and which we really need to ensure that they have in our province. So those are my remarks, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to hearing from people as this proceeds through this House to law amendments and back again. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today in support of this bill and not in support of the bill. It's sort of it's overdue that the Office of Nova Scotian, African Nova Scotian Affairs has been set up. And I commend the government for doing that and congratulate them on doing it. Unfortunately, what I hear from my community, the black community, which I represent, the biggest black community in in Canada, I believe, at this point, the office to date has just been nothing but a token. It really hasn't serviced the needs of the black community in Nova Scotia. The budget is too small, and when I look at the bill and you go through the bill, it's a very brief bill, and it talks about putting in place a CEO, Chief Executive Officer, whereas it really should be a deputy minister level. It should say deputy minister. It shouldn't say CEO, it should say deputy minister. You look at the history in the community, which my honourable colleague from the opposition has talked about, the history of the black Nova Scotians in Canada and in Nova Scotia. What an important contribution they have made to Nova Scotia and to this country. And most people don't realize, but the first Victoria Cross ever given in Canada was given to a black man from this province. A lot of Nova Scotians don't realize that. A lot of Nova Scotians don't realize that up until the mid-70s, a lot of black young people in the Preston area in particular weren't allowed to go to school. This is in the 70s. This is not to 1870, this is 1970. It's unheard of. I was going to school at that time, and I had many friends who went to school that were from the black community, wonderful people to go with, but there wasn't many of them. And the schools I went to, the schools they were supposed to go to, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. Come to find out since then, because of the efforts of many really resourceful and talented people in the Preston area, they took a class action suit against the province so the kids could have equal opportunity to go to school. In the 70s, the 1970s, it's unbelievable that that had to happen at that time. And then we come across with a department here that is a good step forward, and I will give the government every credit for that it possibly can. But I understand the budget's only about $400,000 a year. At $400,000 a year to help address a 65% unemployment rate in the Prestons, within the regional municipality. And you know why it's like that? It's like that because the people couldn't go to school. When I went to school, get a trade, go to university, do the other things, they were discouraged from going to school. The children were asked, what's an escalator? And the kids weren't asked, simple questions. Today we think of an escalator, we use them every day. There they are. In the 60s and 70s, they were a very rare thing in Canada, never mind in Nova Scotia. They didn't ask them how to do the traditional things that they did around the farm and the home to help the family make a living in the community. Those things weren't asked. So we've got a chronic problem in the area, not because the people haven't tried and tried and tried to get this thing corrected. It's been a real problem for them to move these things forward. And we now have and are getting a large group of very well educated, very determined people in our black community that are moving these things forward. And it's a pleasure working with them to see these things happen. To see this year they had a graduation which I assisted them with in North Preston and celebrated all the graduates from the universities and high schools and junior high schools, technical schools that graduated from the in 2002-2003 school year. That's a community celebration to celebrate these things. The East Preston area did the same thing, and the Cherrybrook area did the same thing. It just shows how important they realize that education is now, especially when the parents of these children, some of these children, didn't have an opportunity to get the proper education that they should have had when the time comes. I'd like to see the scope of this department expanded greatly, as would members of my community that represent the black community. There's some really good guiding principles in this thing and things that can help and hopefully will help the community. But I want to see a deputy minister in this department, not a CEO. I think it's a slight to the community, the black communities in Nova Scotia, and I think we need a full deputy minister. And that feeling is supported by the communities I represent. I think that the department should also be tasked with helping educate the older people in the community and the young people that haven't taken opportunity for education to help them make sure they get employment. And I don't mean create jobs for them, I'm not talking about that, but giving them opportunities for special training and things that they should be able to do in order to earn a living and look after themselves. You look at the traditional way in the black community for a lot of men and women, especially men in the community, who work in the summertime and are excellent stonemasons, bricklayers, concrete workers, and asphalt workers, and construction workers that do excellent work here in Nova Scotia, second to none. And what they used to do in the wintertime, they would go and they would cut wood and supplement their income through the winter. Definitely a very energetic group of people and hard-working. But guess what? The longhorn spruce beetle shows up, not allowed to cut trees anymore. So their winter work and employment is gone. It is gone. So what do the people do to support their families? They have a very difficult time. And not anything they've done themselves or anything that they have done wrong. They've tried very, very hard, and I give them a lot of credit for the effort they put forward and for the fine job they do looking after their families as well. But it's difficult to earn a living if your winter work is gone. These are things that the Department of African Nova Scotian Affairs should be really working with the community to help resolve, because the community is a special community. The community is a community of family, and family helping family, and the community helps family. And they have a saying in the black community, it takes a whole community to raise a child, and it's so true. and they live to that. They work to that. It's nice to see when you go to different functions, people there, and things that I remember when I was a child growing up, that how close family was together, and if someone was going to fix something on their property, there was a whole group of people show up to help them. This is the sort of thing that still goes on in the black community today. And I think that makes the community very, very special, and a very special part of our province's culture that we have to protect and promote. The other thing, you talk about steps backwards. Here recently, again, this is something that the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs should have been actively involved in. My learned colleague from the opposition noted Africville and the problems that went on with Africville. Well, there was some problems there. Everybody knows that, and that's now probably headed to court again. And hopefully there'll be a positive result for the people that were removed from Africville. But recently, something else has happened. Community of Lake Loon Cherrybrook has been included in the Preston riding. Now, for the civic election that's coming. Now, on the surface, that sounds really positive and very, very positive. Unfortunately, the community of Cherrybrook Lake Loon wanted to stay with their traditional community that they had worked with for the last 100 years plus. So the community is mobilized to try to get the boundary changed again, back again, so they could stay with Cole Harbour and Humber Park and other areas like this. But no, that didn't happen. And the elections are going to be held later this month, or in October, I should say, on the 16th. And they're going to be excluded from a community that they wanted to be with. Now, if they would have asked, if the community would have asked to be included with the Preston area, that would have been one issue, and that would have been a proper approach to take. But the community didn't ask for that. They didn't even know this was going to be handed their way, and all of a sudden, bang, they're with a community, not a community of interest, that the Act says it has to be a community of interest. It's not the same community of interest anymore. They work to develop Cole Harbour Place and do all these other things, and these are the issues that the African Nova Scotian Affairs Department should actively become involved on, and they really haven't. And the minister for this department is also Minister of Municipal Affairs, and really hasn't responded to the requests for information and assistance from the community as the process has gone on. This whole situation is another area of segregation. It's another type of segregation. The community didn't ask for this, and they've been handed this process. Now, if the minister has some information he'd like to supply in that regard, I'm glad to hear it. But I've got an intimate knowledge of this information. I've got documentation too, so you want to be very careful before you ask any questions. As the process goes through, I think this department has to be a lot stronger department than is laid down in this Act. It has to better represent the inequalities that have been there in the past. We've made a lot of progress in the last 30, 40, or 50 years, or 200 years even, in the black community, for the black community in Nova Scotia. But it should be to the point by now, realistically, that this department wouldn't even be needed, except to hold the cultural integrity of the community. And maybe someday that will be the case, that all Canadians and all Nova Scotians are treated the same and have had the same opportunity for 100 years. That hasn't been the case with the black community. So I'm going to encourage the minister. I know he has the best intentions with this, and he's worked hard to get this in place, and I give him credit for that and the government credit for that. But I want to see this as a deputy minister, not a chief executive officer for this. And I want to see the government put a proper funding in place so that they can help the black community and the communities realize the potential it has. There's a tremendous amount of potential in entertainment. We look at Gary Beals and the things that he has done, and so many other people that have worked and really established a community as an ethical and a positive place that you see the development of real talent. And those talents should have the opportunity to be explored and actually go on the international markets, which a lot of the people in the community have. They have, for the small amount of population, they have a potential for a great deal of talent to be exploited. There are many people presently in the Lake Loon, Cherrybrook, North Preston, East Preston area, to name just a few, that have tremendous talent, singing talent, entertainment talent, and it's important that these opportunities are made available. And I hope through the African Nova Scotian Affairs that special consideration is given to that, and indeed maybe sometime there'll be availability of sound studios and other things that this talent can be exploited and be able to reach their full potential. That's only one of the few things that needs to be done. I'd like to see this bill expanded, and I look forward to members of the community coming in and having their input in this regard, and hopefully over time see some positive changes made in the department to make sure that African Nova Scotians have every opportunity to move their heritage and culture forward, at the same time, excuse me, get a meaningful jobs and opportunities for them and their families. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had a look at this bill when it came forward, and the delivery of services to African Nova Scotian. Mr. Speaker, in my place today at the legislature, I represent the most ethnic diverse community in Atlantic Canada, with a very large black African Nova Scotian community. When I was growing up, we have the only African Orthodox church east of New York City, with the first priest at the church being Father Francis. Today his daughter Isabel is with Father Waterman, and they're in the church today, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the history of the black community is not a pretty one, I guess, in Whitney Pier, as many years have gone by, as my speaker before me had said, of all the different trials and tribulations and hardships in the community over the years. I think of my baseball colleague for many years, Mr. Camp Crawford, who passed away last year, who was the first African Nova Scotian police officer east of Montreal. There's a lot of firsts in the African Nova Scotian community in Whitney Pier, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Tommy Miller, the first alderman in municipal politics in this province, Mr. Speaker. Isaac Fills received the Order of Canada in 1967, Mr. Speaker, from Whitney Pier. Mr. Speaker, he came here from the Barbados as a horticulturist to practice farming in Cape Breton. Upon arriving and realizing that he was not going to be granted any land in this province or any way of applying his trade in Cape Breton, he ended up going to work, as many other immigrants in my community, at Sydney Steel, and worked there for many years and raised his family. He received the Order of Canada for all his children being raised in doctors and lawyers and nurses all across this great country of ours. And again, Mr. Speaker, I think of Winston Rook, the first African Nova Scotian international president of Local 1064 United Steelworkers of America. A great man, Mr. Speaker, and a good family friend of my father's as I stand here today. And the many battles that they fought over labor unrest in the community, and also unrest within their own community, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Joe Worrell, 1969 Canada Games, great ball player. Had the privilege and honor of playing with him for 4 or 5 years before Joe retired. An excellent ball player and probably one of my mentors in my life, Mr. Speaker. But as I speak here today and I think of all the different ball tournaments and events that I've traveled with members of the black community, I think of all the hardships over the years. And late into the 60s, as my speaker before me, my colleague had said, and even in the 70s. Well, I can even go into the 80s, Mr. Speakers, and being part of this province somewheres and having racial slurs and names called and rocks being thrown at ball players in the outfield in Nova Scotia in the late 80s when I played with the Tupper Street Cardinals, which was an all-black ball team from Whitney Pier, Mr. Speaker. Won the Cape Breton Championship in 1983 and went on to Yarmouth for the Nova Scotia title, Mr. Speaker. And I think of when we arrived in this place at that time, and there were so many African Nova Scotians on the team, that one of the residents had asked, were we in town for a basketball tournament, Mr. Speaker? which I thought, it wasn't funny at that time. I said, no, we're here for a baseball tournament. I'm very proud of the African Nova Scotian history in my community. I'm just hoping that there's no, in this bill that we see here before us today, there's actually no budget. I've sent the letter off to the minister no less than 2 months ago and got a reply back from him that there was actually, it was a new office with a very limited budget, with a CEO and another staff person. I agree with my colleague that there should be a deputy minister in this position, Mr. Speaker. There absolutely should be a deputy minister, not a CEO. Every other department has a deputy minister, Mr. Speaker. The provincial government said they're going to look after the delivery of services to African Nova Scotians. Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister was given a note from my community by the Black Employment Office just recently, by Karen McIver Green, looking for some training for African Nova Scotians in the trade unions or in the cleanup of the tar ponds. Hopefully, that area of what we now call Whitney Pier had a separate area at that time called the Co-Covens. And the Co-Covens was primarily an African Nova Scotian neighborhood. It had its own way of life, I guess, and I say in a very... and today, Mr. Speaker, the Black Employment Office is located on Victoria Road in Whitney Pier, and that what their job is to find employment for African Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. A very good friend of mine, Darren Desmond, a colleague of mine and fellow graduate of the Youth Worker Program at Holland College, is now works in the Black Educator Society in Sydney. A great guy and a good friend, actually, Mr. Speaker. Also, we have 2 African Nova Scotian support workers in our school system in Whitney Pier that travel to schools and work specifically with African Nova Scotian children to help them, encourage them to stay in school. The dropout rate amongst the community in African Nova Scotian is not right, Mr. Speaker. There's just too many children in that area and that African Nova Scotian descent are not going on to university because they can't afford to go there. So it's about time that this government stepped up to the plate and tried to provide and delivery of some of these services that everybody else takes for granted, that we as a society take for granted, Mr. Speaker. Some of the people had fought for many, many years in this community to, and Mr. Speaker, the fight is still ongoing. It's still ongoing today, Mr. Speaker. In my office, I sometimes receive hiring practices by the province of Nova Scotia, questioning why is there an affirmative action policy in the province of Nova Scotia, or is the government making some kind of avenue for these people to get employment and seek employment within the provincial government itself, Mr. Speaker, whether it be Access Nova Scotia, Department of Lands and Forest, Department of Motor Vehicles. Recently had a friend of mine come in looking for a job. He'd applied 3 times to the Department of Natural Resources, and all 3 times was refused his employment there. Not on his ability, Mr. Speaker, I'm not to say what it would be on, but refused at all times. So I think some of the doors are still closed in this community. I think it's about time that we're heading in the right direction. But with a department with such a small budget and only 2 employees, I don't know how much they can do. I don't know if they'll be overwhelmed with caseloads and overwhelmed with what is their job going to be. Are they going to be able to help service groups within the community? Are they going to be able to help the Melnick Hall in Whitney Pier? Are they going to be able to help the Hankett Street Hall in Whitney Pier?
Order. Would the honourable member allow for an introduction?
I think so.
Yes, you will. Thank you. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you very much, and sorry to interrupt, because this is a good piece of legislation that will serve all our communities, and we all have, many of us have African Nova Scotian communities in our ridings. But I do want to draw the House's attention to a visitor in our gallery who is new to the PC Caucus office, our newest researcher, Gina Sherrington. Gina lives in Enfield, and we welcome her here, and she's a big addition to the PC Caucus team, and wish her welcome. In Lance.
Thank you. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as my colleague had just said, the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs Office established is very important, but there's still lots of work to do within this office. I'm looking forward to seeing what the full mandate of the office. It says in their release that assist, support, and enhance the provincial government delivery of services to African Nova Scotians. Well, I hope it does, Mr. Speaker. We can always move forward on these issues, Mr. Speaker, whether it be in Whitney Pier, whether it be in Preston, whether it be whatever part of the end of this province, we can always move forward. Mr. Speaker, Whitney Pier has a long history of African Nova Scotian people and people coming there to work on the steel plant. But over the years, I think things have gotten better. It's been a struggle. I think of my friend Travis Desmond, who is now a fireman. He's been there for over 20 years. I think of my next door neighbor, which is Barry Burke and Bradley Best, who are now and Darren McDonald, who are our police officers at the CBRM. It wasn't easy for those strides, but a guy like Campy Crawford paved the way for these African Nova Scotian peoples and all the things that he did in his lifetime, for these young men to be employed at the Cape Breton Regional Police Service today, and Travis to be employed at the Fire Department today, Mr. Speaker. These are all good people, Mr. Speaker. I think that the speaker before me mentioned about education in the community, but we've had lots of education for African Nova Scotians in our community. We've prided ourselves on that, Mr. Speaker. They were always afforded an opportunity in the 60s and 70s and 80s for education. And many of them have went on today. As I'm talking to you today, I think of my friend Dean Smith, who's now a lawyer here in Halifax for the federal government. I think of Barbara Miller, Tommy Miller's son. He was the first alderman. His daughter is a lawyer here in Halifax. I think of Clotilda Yatmachuk, the Order of Canada, again from Whitney Pier, Mr. Speaker, African Nova Scotian for nursing in Grenada. Recently, last year, as early as last year, received the Order of Nova Scotia. I think of her son, Kenny Douglas, a practicing lawyer here in Halifax, Mr. Speaker. I think of my friend who I spoke to earlier today before I spoke and rose on this legislation, was Mr. Herbie Desmond, works at the Human Rights Commission here in Halifax. And I think of Father Francis, his daughter, Mayam Francis, is actually the director of Human Services. Human Rights Commission here in Halifax, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry. These are all people that were born and raised in Whitney Pier. And I've seen some of the trials and tribulations that they've gone through to reach the pinnacle where they are today in life, Mr. Speaker. And I think that this is good for the province of Nova Scotia. And I look forward to discussing the Office of African Nova Scotian with my many friends in my community of Whitney Pier and area, and also discussing with the minister, Mr. Speaker. Look forward to law amendments. I'm hoping lots of people will come forward with their views on this, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll recognize the honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to just speak briefly on the Bill 101. I want to begin by commending the Minister of Municipal Relations for taking a proactive approach and bringing this legislation forward. I do not have any large areas of African Americans in my constituency, but I do have reserves of First Nations. And I mention that simply because, and you may say, well, what do they have in common? And Mr. Speaker, we have people that have been suppressed for a long time and continuing to be held back in a lot of areas. The people from my local area and some of the government officials are aware of the fact that just only a year ago, we signed an agreement between the 5 First Nations and 5 municipalities, and one of the elders of the First Nations, Elder Albert Marshall, said it took 750 years to get to that point to sign that agreement where we work together. And I'm wondering how long it took to get to this stage to recognize the African American societies and their contributions. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to just point out that I, too, would like to reiterate what the previous speaker has said, and my colleague also who has spoke on it, that I would like to see the minister take it to a higher level so that that office and that department is funded so that the office could be effective and deliberate in what it intends to do. I also like to point out the fact that see what happens when people are given an opportunity, and I'll just mention one. Gary Beals, a fellow who was given an opportunity and became known Canada-wide and highly respected, and a supreme amount of talent. If there's that much talent in one, what do we have that can come forward from the rest? And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to that. And I conclude my remarks by saying, Mr. Speaker, aren't we all supposed to be Nova Scotians and treated equally? Thank you.
Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and make a number of interventions on this particular piece of legislation. It's a very important piece of legislation, and I certainly don't want to be repetitive by echoing many of the comments that have been made by previous speakers. But I wanted to rise and relay and share with members of the this chamber some of my experience and knowledge that may be of some value and for someone who doesn't come from the black community. My first real experience, Mr. Speaker, with racial relations was back in 1972 when I was participating in the first non-native exchange program in the province of Nova Scotia at the high school level. And I felt at that time, and I still feel to this very day, it was a very successful program that made individuals such as myself very sensitive to the aspirations and the needs of different cultures that certainly weren't common to the community that I was born and raised in, because the community I was raised in, Mr. Speaker, for the most part, either you were Irish or you were Scotch, and that was about the extent of it. And so there was a certain convention or attitude that if you weren't Scotch or you weren't Irish, then you weren't a Cape Bretoner, which in reality, Mr. Speaker, that was so